Hello, I'm Jaime Teevan, Chief Scientist and Technical Fellow at Microsoft, and a first-time ESPC attendee. Woo! I'm really excited to be here. I've heard great things about this community and about this event. I've certainly had a lot of really interesting conversations yesterday and this morning, and enjoyed exploring Dublin. Although I have to say, I'm a little nervous about speaking with you all. This is different than my normal community. I normally speak at academic conferences. If I weren't here right now, I'd be in San Diego at NeurIPS, which is one of the big academic machine learning conferences. And I came here because I was excited to get to chat with you all and meet you, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about like kind of the science, and we're going to get a little nerdy. Might help sort of illuminate some of the things that are happening underlying the products and features and things that you've been seeing throughout the day and will continue to see. This morning, Jeff, for example, talked about SharePoint. And he talked about how in a couple of months, SharePoint is turning 25, which got me thinking about the past 25 years. And it was a little over 25 years ago, actually, that I went to the MIT AI lab and started studying for my doctorate in personalized search. And, I like to pretend that I was really prescient and understood how important AI was going to be. But honestly, I have been just as surprised or potentially even more surprised with where we are with AI right now than you likely are. In part because I saw how little it could do and how hard I struggled for a really long time to figure out how to realize the true potential of the technology. In fact, I had a bet with my husband over 25 years ago while we were in college. So he was just my boyfriend at the time, a cute boy who sort of got me into computer science. I had a bet with him that AI would not pass the Turing test in our lifetime. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Turing test, but it was developed by Alan Turing in the 1950s. And it's essentially a test to see whether a human can determine the difference between AI and another human, typically through a text-based interaction. And needless to say, I lost that bet. And you may think that you're able to tell the difference between AI and a human, but you aren't. Study after study actually shows that people think AI-generated content was more likely to be generated by a human than human-generated content. And we come up with all these clever, we're like, ooh, but there's an M dash there. Must be AI-generated. Turns out we're not very good at doing that. These past 25 years, however, seem like they've really passed in a blink of an eye. And I find that ironic because the past week feels like it passed over the course of 5 years. We joke about AI time and how much it seems like things 2 months ago were forever ago. And that's in part because there's so much change happening right now. And what happens when there's lots of change is your brain lays down memory markers. And these memory markers are what feel like a lot of time. So if everything's routine and you're doing things the same, you're not laying down a bunch of memory markers and things pass in a blink of an eye. And when you're doing new things, you've got I think of that when I had my first baby, the first 6 weeks felt like they were forever because literally every single thing that I did was brand new. And recently, there has been a lot of disruption and a lot of change in how we get work done. So much so that I feel like I'm giving a talk all the time where I'm like, this is a once-in-a-generation change in work. And I said that about the move to the cloud. And I said that in 2020 when we all shifted to remote work overnight. And I find myself saying that now with the rise of AI. And, it's a lot of change and it feels overwhelming. And I'm like, what's wrong with me that I keep saying there's a once in a generation change happening? And then I say it about something else. The aha moment for me was that these weren't actually different shifts. They were just chapters in one bigger shift that we're in the middle of living through right now. So none of those things could exist on their own. And in fact, when you think about, for example, the rapid shift to remote work, it's amazing that we were able to take all of the office workers, which represents about a third of the working population, and overnight enable them to work from home remotely. And I'm sure a lot of you know, that was a lot of work. It wasn't like it was easy. There was a lot of that. But if it hadn't been that a majority of our customers, for example, were in the cloud prior to March 2020, that would have never been able to happen. And when you hear about the current moment that we are in with AI, one of the things that's really made where we are possible is scale. The foundational algorithms underlying much of what we're doing, neural nets, have existed since, before I got my PhD in AI. The reason that we see this emergent behavior is because we've managed to scale up those approaches. And we scale them through compute, we scale them through data, and we scale them through algorithms that allow us to do those same approaches at a larger scale. So if you've heard of transformer models, that's essentially a way of directing attention during training so that you can do a little bit better with scale. But we wouldn't have had the scale of infrastructure without the move to the cloud. And then we wouldn't have had the scale of data to understand work, and we wouldn't have had the scale of surfaces to bring AI to support people without the shift to remote work. And so where we are in the rise to AI is just a part of that, and it's enabled by that, and it is the same thing. And actually, that's important to understand, because actually we're still at the beginning of this shift. And so I put on that slide the rise of AI, but that's not the end point. We're in one baby step into AI. And, when I think about all this change and I feel overwhelmed and I think about all that's happening, it helps me to recognize that it's one big shift. It also helps me, as all the technology is changing around us, it helps me to think about the things that aren't changing. And that's us. People aren't changing. The way we get work done isn't changing. What it means to be human remains the same. What it means to work remains the same. The technology is changing. And it forces us to reflect on what is static in a new way. So we've been studying work for decades, even computer-supported work. We've been studying for decades. Microsoft just turned 50 last year. We understand that work is purposeful. We understand that work is persistent. We understand that work is collaborative. And as we move to the cloud, as we move remote, as we start working with AI, those are just new lenses to view what it means to be purposeful, what it means to be persistent, and what it means to be collaborative. And so what I'm going to talk about today is the impact of this current generation of language models on those constants. So let's think about where we are right now in the rise of AI. Like I said, we're in that baby step in the rise of AI. And we're pretty much using AI to do the things that we know how to do ourselves and that are easy to do. I think of this current moment really as the rise of personal productivity. And, even though it's just a baby steps, we're already seeing really, really big changes with that. It's what lets us know how big this revolution we are in the middle of is right now. Probably the big thing is I talked about how work is purposeful. Previously, when working with computers, we had to translate that purpose into like button clicks and like mouse movements so that the computer would understand what we wanted to do. And now we can use natural language. I think of that demo from Jeff's keynote this morning with Excel. Nobody goes to Excel with the purpose of creating a pivot table. You go to Excel because you want to balance a budget or you want to understand some data. And it's awesome that you can now do that and describe what you want to do. And then the technology will actually translate that into what the computer understands. But we're still just really early. I appreciate that our customers have understood how early we are in this journey. And as a scientist, I really appreciate how much our customers have been willing to experiment with us as well. So to try and understand the impact that Copilot had on work, when we first shipped, not even shipped, like the before, I forget what we call it, that when we first did like early access to Copilot, our customers worked with us, and probably some of you in this room worked with us, to actually understand and study the impact that Copilot has on work, and actually worked to randomly allocate those precious early access Copilot seats to their employees so that we could actually run randomized controlled trials and understand in a causal, statistically valid manner what impact Copilot had on work. And what we saw was really significant changes. So remember, this is a randomized controlled trial. This is real impact. This is causal. People who are using Copilot create 10% more documents when using Copilot than when not. People who are using Copilot spend 11% less time in email than people who are not using Copilot. This is like the first early versions of Copilot. You can imagine how much bigger the impact is now. Up until this point, when we had done this study, pretty much all studies of AI in work context were done in laboratory settings. And that's because AI hadn't yet been, and I mean large language models, generative AI, hadn't been deployed at scale in work context up until that point. And so we had been seeing differences like this in lab contexts, but those were like controlled. You sit somebody down and you give them a task, presumably a task that you think AI will actually be useful on, and look at the change in behavior. This is changes in behavior in real tasks, in real world, what people are doing for actual work. It's huge. And it's using AI in the most boring way possible. Do we really think the future of work is using AI to generate content so other people can use AI to summarize that content? We're getting time back as AI makes us more efficient. We need to figure out how to use that time in new ways to get new things done. And so it actually helps then to look at those things we know about work. I talked a little bit about how AI is letting people express their purpose. We also know that work is persistent, and we know that work is collaborative. And that's sort of the next stage that we have ahead of us. And interestingly, when you're just using AI for your own personal gain, it has externalities that impact the collective. You've probably all heard tell of AI slop. I know my kids consume a lot of AI slop on their phones. It's essentially the thoughtlessly generated AI content that floods social media, and it's fun. Ooh, this is an interesting video of a baby dancing. But it's crap. And we call AI slop in a work context, work slop. So Jeff Hancock is a professor at Stanford, and he and some of his colleagues published an article last month talking about work slop and talking about the costs that work slop has in an enterprise. He found that people who receive work slop from other people found the person who sent them work slop 42% less trustworthy and viewed them as 37% less intelligent. And perhaps importantly, a full third of them were less likely to want to collaborate again with the person who sent them work slop. Basically, a naive use of AI transfers the effort from the creator to the recipient. It's a selfish use of AI. You're more efficient, but in the process, you make group productivity worse. So how do you address that? You intentionally design AI to support collaboration. So Microsoft has collaboration at the core of the tools that we've built. And you've heard a lot today about all of these different tools. For example, we've got Teams, we've got SharePoint, we've got Outlook. People even collaborate in Office around Office documents and other things. And they all represent different kinds of collaboration. So if you think about like a Teams meeting, that's a synchronous collaboration where you're working together in real time. Something like Outlook, or if you're using Teams chat or channels, that's more of an asynchronous collaboration. SharePoint is collaborating around knowledge. And you can see we have hundreds of millions of people are using these collaborative tools. And I think even more important than the raw numbers is the intensity of usage. So sure, hundreds of millions of people are using Teams, but do you know how many minutes those people spend in Teams meetings? They spend billions of minutes. SharePoint is used to support 21 billion workflows every week. And so the question that we have to answer going forward is, how will AI remake collaboration? The state-of-the-art technology underlying AI is evolving quickly. And there are new approaches. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the approaches we're using, but they're changing fast. There's new research getting published today at NeurIPS that is going to change something, I say, today in the next week. But Microsoft has decades of knowledge and understanding in the things that don't change. And it's that knowledge about what's not changing that we need to bring to bear. And we can use that. We can sort of think about what does it mean to take AI and the changing technology and what we know about human work and how humans get things done and human productivity. And we can think about how that changes the way that we work, how we get work done. We can think about how it changes the artifacts of work, how we create and store knowledge. And especially as a scientist, I think a lot about how it changes the tools that we build and the models that we build that underlie our ability to get things done. And so that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this time. So I'm going to talk about AI native processes and what those look like. I'm going to talk about shared knowledge, and I'm going to talk about socially intelligent AI and how we build that. And so let's start it with AI native processes. There's sort of two different ways you can think about what it means for AI to start operating in collaborative spaces. At this point, I'm pretty sure all of you have used AI individually and had your own conversations with AI. And hopefully some of you have played with, facilitator, channel agent, but that's probably still pretty new to you. And there's two models that we can think about when we're thinking about what it might look like, because it's helpful to build from something that we know and we understand. One is we can build from our experience with AI. And what does it look like to bring other people into AI with us? This is the Teams mode that we saw in this morning's keynote, where you can start, you've got your individual session with Copilot and bring other people into that. The other way to come at it is to think about the fact that we already, as humans, are collaborating a lot. And what does it mean to bring AI into existing human collaborations to make those human collaborations better? And this is something like facilitator or channel agent. And so we're gonna like stew on those two concepts a little bit. Let's start with thinking about what it means to bring multiple people into a AI chat session. So this is what an AI chat session looks like roughly, right? You write a prompt and you provide some grounding information and then you pass some judgment on the output. I know the interesting thing is 2 years ago, this wouldn't have seemed obvious to you. Like this is something that we've learned as a foundational way that we get things done. And honestly, in 2 years, when we look back, it's going to be shocking that we thought of this as these as individual tasks. These are actually collaborative tasks. It's taken a bunch of like metacognitive work to figure this out, to figure out how to do each of these pieces. Essentially, it's up-leveling the work that we do as an individual to think about how we express what we want and provide the right context and pass judgment. And like that's where you have to up-level the work that we're doing as teams as well to start thinking about how to use AI. So let's start with thinking about writing a prompt, right? The writing a prompt is foundationally about expressing intent. And like when you look at maybe a year and a half ago, most of the research coming out in the AI community was actually largely about prompt engineering. And I've written papers and articles about prompt engineering. And actually, you can see like a lot of the innovation that we're seeing now came in first from that research into prompt engineering. So people did a bunch of research, like chain of thought, the deep reasoning models that exist now, like GPT-5, essentially took a prompt engineering technique to get the model to express its chain of thought and started training that into the model. So this is a skill that we've learned to express our intent, to provide the right context. It looks different for groups. Like, what does it mean for a group to write a prompt? It probably isn't like we all sit down, like we have a little meeting and get together and like collaboratively write a single prompt. Instead, actually, the way that you express intent is through conversation. You talk. And like, this makes it challenging. This means the models need to be a little different. You know, the underlying goal that a group has is often implicit. It may vary by people. We all kind of bring to a particular task slightly different intents. We have some of our personal goals as well as the shared group goals, and it evolves. That process of aligning over time with a group is actually, it's interesting, it's called grounding. You know, we arrive at common ground. So essentially what people have to do in a group for writing a prompt is arrive at common ground about the task and what you want to do. And then that brings us to this piece about providing grounding. So it's kind of funny. So like human collaboration and discourse, we call grounding the process of arriving. In AI, we call grounding the process of providing the underlying content that provides context to the model. And this is relatively newer. The first thing you did when you first started using a large language model was just write the prompt. And it became pretty clear that providing this context was really important. It's part of what makes Copilot so awesome is that it will go, you know, you can name files that you want to ground in, or it will run SharePoint searches and actually ground your interaction in your actual content. And this becomes different when you start thinking about group context. What does it mean to ground on what a set of people want? All of a sudden, you have really complex permissions to deal with. Really interesting research problems, lots of really interesting work kind of underlying what we do in SharePoint to think about what documents, who has access to what documents and how that changes over time. So group work is essentially about pulling together that context, arriving at your goal and pulling together that context so that you can operate well on that. Like a good early way to start thinking about that actually is even thinking about one of the things that I found when I work with, this is kind of interesting. You saw as people started using Copilot, like, oh, it would produce fun out. You're like, oh, this is a poem about the summary of the meeting I attended. I'd be like, this is cool. I'm going to go share this with Alex and copy it and send it over to him. One of the things that you start finding is actually the prompt becomes useful too. So we make it possible and easy to copy over the prompt. Actually, it's quite useful to share grounding information too. We all have different interactions because of that grounding information. So even when you're just thinking about how you use Copilot individually, thinking about what you're grounding matters. And then finally, there's judgment. And this is the process of deciding whether the AI output is good enough or whether you need to iterate or try something else. This is an extremely important part, and it's actually a part that we often skip. And it's what ends up causing work slop, is because we skip it and go expect the person reading the content to pass judgment instead. And now we know they will pass bad judgment on us, so we should be careful. But it becomes really interesting when you start thinking in a group context how you support that group decision making and what are the processes you want. Do you want a group to vote on the outcome? Do you assign a decision maker? It forces us to become really explicit about authority and accountability. And these challenges here, they actually highlight that a lot of the challenges of groups working with AI are group challenges. So it's not enough just to bring groups into AI use. You actually want to start thinking about how AI can unlock those challenges for groups as well, which brings us to the other direction that I was talking about, and thinking about what it means to bring AI into human collaboration, to unlock some of the challenges that we see there. And human collaboration is amazing. We're good at it. We collaborate with each other from when we're born. And yet, it breaks down. Human collaboration in particular breaks down at boundaries. And the opportunity we have with AI is to provide bridges where it breaks down. So if you think about, for example, in a Teams meeting, how you can now, if you speak a different language from the person you're meeting with, you can get real-time translation of the conversation. That's like Star Trek sci-fi stuff, and we can do that right now. And actually, it's kind of obvious that that's useful when we speak different languages. I actually find it useful even when I speak the same language. That bridging knowledge gaps are real gaps. I'll be in a meeting sometimes and somebody will say something that I can tell was clever, but I didn't quite internalize it right. And asking Copilot to rephrase that for me actually helps me understand it better. AI can help also with bridging spatial boundaries. Actually, Teams was a great, I talked about the shift to remote work. In many ways, we passed that bridge. It was hard, but we were forced to pass that bridge in 2020. I know I started, for example, I'm located in Seattle, Washington. We have an amazing research team in Cambridge. And I started doing a lot more collaboration during the pandemic with the folks in MSR Cambridge, because all of a sudden all my meetings were remote anyway. The thing that Teams didn't solve for me though, was the time zone problem. And it's still 8 hours later here. And so there was a narrow kind of window where we were able to have meetings. You're gonna see AI start to bridge this temporal boundary more as well. And you see that already happening with the fact that people are using summaries for meetings as a way to catch up for meetings. You don't have to be at a meeting and be like, oh, what happened in that meeting? Did anybody talk about me? What did they say about this topic that I'm interested in? And you even see people starting to do a little bit of proactive attending meetings as well. There's interesting research happening in this space. During the pandemic, you would sometimes see people record videos to show during a meeting if they couldn't make it. There are emerging prototypes about how do you say, oh, these are some topics. If this comes up, please say that I'm interested in this aspect of it. Another really interesting way that human collaboration breaks down is its scale. Now, I don't know if my mom taught me that 8 people was the perfect number of people to have at a dinner table. And there's a reason for that. It's because 8 people is the number of people that you can successfully have a conversation with. Any more than that, and collaboration starts to break down. You just can't hold that many people and that many conversations in your head. AI doesn't have that limitation. And so it's super cool to see the way that AI can start aggregating across a bunch of people. The place that I see that happening, just as like a kind of interesting example right now, is restaurant reviews. So it used to be the only thing that you could really easily average across restaurant reviews was the number of stars. And so that's why you'd be like, ooh, this restaurant has 4.2 stars. Now, you can actually take hundreds of natural language reviews of a restaurant and aggregate against them as well. And be like, oh, this restaurant has great atmosphere, but it doesn't have very good vegetarian options. So if AI lets us now synthesize across hundreds of people, the question then becomes, where does that synthesis or that meaning live? And that brings us to thinking about shared knowledge and how the artifact of work is changing in an AI era. And I think that's something that we've talked a lot about over the course of the day. Especially because, Microsoft came into existence as a document company, right? We were essentially, one of our key tasks is to help people create and share documents as a form of electronic persistence. And what we're seeing now with large language models is that the kind of knowledge, the way that people are creating and using knowledge is changing. It's less document-centric and is more centered on conversations with the language model, meeting transcripts, chat. Knowledge is getting stored and created in those transcripts. And that kind of makes sense, actually. When you study human workflows and how work gets done, it doesn't actually start with a document. Typically, by the time you're at a document, you're fairly far along in a workflow. The real genesis of ideas and work happens in conversations. That's why you're here, is to have conversations with each other, right? You may leave this event and then write a trip report or capture some notes. But the knowledge is getting generated in the conversations that you're having today. Copilot Pages is a great kind of realization of that. It's essentially recognizing that people may have all this conversation with a language model, with Copilot, but that is not the piece that persists. What you want to take is actually turn that knowledge into something that persists, which is a Copilot page. And you see people starting to use this in their workflows. So one of the kind of fun emergent behaviors that we see from customers is customers who want to create a document or a presentation actually having brainstorming meetings. Setting up a Teams meeting to brainstorm with the express intent of then taking that transcript and turning it into the document. So the whole work becomes about having really interesting conversations and less about the process of writing that document. So documents are getting created differently. They're also getting used differently. Increasingly, we're seeing fewer and fewer people go to documents to read the documents, and instead, taking the Copilot summary of the document and perhaps asking questions of the document. And what's more is, people might not even explicitly know what document they're going to, because when you speak with Copilot, Copilot can then go search and find documents and then use that to ground your interaction. Like on a set of things related to a topic or related to a project. Essentially, what's happening is documents still matter, but they're being created and consumed via conversation. There is a lot of research happening at Microsoft and in the academic community then to start thinking about what does it mean to decouple knowledge from the documents that it's stored in. How do we index that knowledge so that it is quickly accessible for language models to use, and also so that it, that you can derive interesting insights that might take longer than the 100 milliseconds that we have to actually fetch information when you have an active request. A lot of interesting work happening around permissions. So who sees what and how do you handle those as they change? And also interesting work around a concept called dreaming. I like the concept of, sometimes we anthropomorphize AI. Y'all are probably familiar by now with the concept of hallucination, which is a less positive analogy. I like the analogy of dreaming. If you think at night, what do you do when you're dreaming? You sort of synthesize and encode all the information you've taken in during the day. An AI model can do that, operate over a data estate, and essentially dream to predict important units of knowledge that might be needed for future inference. And this is useful both because it makes future interactions efficient, but also because it might draw interesting connections that you wouldn't have seen across disparate content in your data estate. So that's a little bit, so like the way that knowledge is getting stored is different. And that matters in part because also knowledge is getting stored in models. Essentially, the weights of a language model are a form of knowledge storing. And it's different kinds of knowledge. Language models aren't great for storing facts. It's the reason you see hallucination. But it's great for storing processes and inference and style. However, the current generation of language models were built for individuals. And so they don't work well in collaborative contexts or in group contexts. They were essentially trained on the output of work. Models have been trained on the public web. So it'll be final documents to the extent that it's trained on collaborative data. It'll be something like social media, which doesn't look like enterprise collaboration. Or, there's some kinds of transcripts. US congressional hearings is an example of a transcript that's available publicly. Doesn't look like real work. And so then these models that are trained on the public web are fine-tuned to be able to work even better for individuals. So for example, one of the things that was a real success behind ChatGPT before it launched was that it was instruction-tuned, which is essentially teaching the model through a process called RLHF how to follow instructions so that you tell it to do something and then it replies to do something. And that is not an accurate representation for how collaborative settings work. And it means that it's not enough to simply add more people into an interaction with a language model. We need to build AI that is socially intelligent. Collaborative models are different. They're trained on different data. They are trained using different kinds of feedback. And they go towards different goals. I talked about instruction tuning. One of the things that's really interesting is group goals are different than individual instructions. It means actually, rather than a single instruction, you often want to take whole segments of conversation or have the group actively define the goal that it's going after. This means that timing matters a lot in collaborative models. So you will have noticed in the demos this morning, when facilitator is present or when Copilot is being used in Teams mode, the model needs to be explicitly mentioned. So you will say at Copilot, can you tell us that? The real unlock is when the model understands in collaborative contexts when to speak up. So it's not just what to say, but when it has something of value to provide. And all of this requires social intelligence, understanding people's roles, the group dynamics, and the context. And so the two key things that we use to learn these sorts of things in a language model is one is the data. It requires collaborative data. And I already talked a little bit about how models aren't trained on data that looks like real work. It means the models are operating at something we call at a distribution. And when a model's operating at a distribution, it's not able to do as good of a job. It doesn't understand the multi-person nuances. The big trend right now in the academic community around data is synthetic data generation. And for synthetic data generation, essentially you use a language model to generate more data like the kind you want to train the model on. And this is great for AI because scale is important. I talked about how scale was the big unlock in recent years for where we are. Being able to generate synthetic data allows you to basically have a larger scale data. The problem is, when you're operating at a distribution, a language model doesn't do a good job generating that data. And so at Microsoft, it is explicitly our deep interest and expertise in collaboration that allows us to develop sophisticated approaches to accurately generate synthetic data that looks like real-world collaborative data while living up to our commitments to not ever train on customer data and not look at customer data. Been really interesting innovations and opportunity there that will make the AI act better in your work setting. And in addition to data, probably the other key thing for training a model is the feedback. I mean, these are essentially, if you think about it, like the algorithms are part of it, but the key pieces of a model are the data it's trained on and the feedback that it's provided. In supervised fine-tuning, you collect offline labels, and basically what you do is you pass some data through the model, you calculate something, and if it matches the label, that's great. If it doesn't match the label, you go and update the weight so that the next time you pass the data, it'll be closer to the label. So this is all well and good for pretty straightforward tasks. The challenge is collaboration. It's really hard to get these offline labels. It's already hard to get people to provide you with labeled data, regardless, because a lot of what your interactions are contextual, they're personalized. But in a collaborative setting, it's even harder because, like, I might, if Copilot speaks up in a meeting that I'm at, I might be like, oh, that's awesome. But Caruana might be like, ew, that was annoying. I didn't want to hear it. And so, like, how do you deal with those different interactions? So what we find is it is very essential to collect goal-directed in situ feedback from interactions to align the model more with group behavior. And so this is another place where our investment as a company in collaboration really matters. State of the art for feedback right now, which you might hear about, this is what sort of all frontier companies are doing, is expert labeling. They're paying lots of money to get experts to label things. But where are, and we are the experts in collaboration. Getting explicit feedback, though, as I said, around collaboration is extremely hard, but people provide feedback naturally in collaborative settings because it's part of how we interact with people. I smile and nod when you say something's interesting, and I look at my phone if you're saying something's boring. So you can actually look, if somebody says thank you to a language model a lot, that's probably a good interaction. If somebody repeats the same thing over and over again, that's probably a negative interaction. Another great example is actually emoji use. It's impossible to get somebody to give a thumbs up. My background is actually personalized search. That was my PhD, was studying information retrieval. You cannot for the life of you get an end user to thumbs up or thumbs down a link in the search result. But we all will happily heart or put a little puppy dog emoji on somebody's message that they put in Teams chat. I've talked about how AI provides a lens by which we can look at how we work together differently and how we can start to think about the artifacts of work differently. And I've talked about how collaboration requires us to think about the models that we build differently. But honestly, none of those are the questions that I tend to hear from people. The question that's probably most on your mind is this real existential angst that we all have. That's how do I have to be different? And, I want you to remember, like I said, who we are, how we work, that doesn't change. What's interesting about AI is that it isn't human. We know how to get more human intelligence. We can hire more people. We can have more babies. Human intelligence, we know that. What's interesting about AI is how AI is different from human intelligence. And I'm sure you hear a lot this metaphor of an AI is oh, you can hire your own intern as an AI. And that's just because it's a useful metaphor to differentiate from how we understood computers before. Computers are deterministic. We're used to working with computers and they do exactly what you tell them. And when you first start thinking about AI, that's weird. And it causes us to make kind of the wrong decisions around AI. You know, we keep being like, oh, AI is going to do all the repeatable stuff that we want to do. Oh, no, turns out it's like repeatable stuff. It makes mistakes sometimes. Like, that's automation is great. But like AI has variation. It does things stochastically. And so it's interesting to think about it for a little bit as a human, because we understand, like, oh, yes, a person's not going to do things perfectly. You know, we're like, oh, AI hallucinates. You know what? If you look at Wikipedia or even the encyclopedia, there are errors there too. Like, humans hallucinate, we make mistakes. That is part of the real world. But it's just a metaphor. So like, I like to think about how AI is different. And I think it opens up sort of some of that next step about how we stop just using AI to do the things that we know how to do and start using it to do new things. So here are 4 areas that I think are interesting, and I'm sure you can come up with some yourself as you think about it. So one is feedback. Giving and getting feedback from AI is different from doing it with a human. I actually find it really stressful to give people feedback. I have no problem telling AI that it's wrong, and it's more comfortable to get feedback from AI. You can try out dumb things and ask for responses. You can ask questions you think somebody might think is silly from you, silly. You know, but actually that discomfort you feel is useful. Humans learn from discomfort, like that sting you feel when you make a mistake. It actually drives change. Language models are happy to make mistakes. You can go then figure out, like, we use mistakes in places where AI works and where it doesn't to train and make the model better, but the model doesn't feel. It means it can take risks, but it also means that it lacks intrinsic guardrails. And that's the reason having human oversight is so important, because we feel pain when we make mistakes. Another interesting difference is speed. AI works instantaneously. It gives us instantaneous access to feedback. It used to be if I wrote an email and I wanted to know if it might land weirdly for people, I'd have to send it to someone and ask if they saw any red flags. I can now get that immediately. So that unblocks work. But even more cool is repeatability. Actually, with AI, I can ask for feedback from different perspectives. Oh, what would you think of this email? Are there any red flags from an engineer's perspective, or from a UX designer perspective, or from a customer perspective? You know, it's kind of cool with AI. You can erase all of the background and history and start afresh. If I really screwed up on this keynote, I couldn't be like, oh, I missed it, let's start again, and then just expect you all to forget everything I said. But you can do that with AI. And like, that's something to take advantage of, to try out to simulate different things, try things out differently. And then of course, scale is a big difference. You know, I talked about that. I honestly can barely handle 8 people at a dinner table. But being able to work with hundreds of people is amazing. And so if we take these different aspects of AI and we combine it with what we know is so awesome and special about human collaboration, it becomes clear that there's really large, meaningful change ahead. And if you take one thing away from this talk, I would like that to be that you should stop focusing on using AI for individual productivity and start thinking about how AI improves the conversations that we have together and the knowledge that we create together. So I hope you have a lot of interesting conversations at ESPC. Thank you.